Okay, and so thanks again, everybody, for coming. We are 1 minute past the hour. We'll get started in just a second here. So we are going to walk you through today a crash course on NetSuite user roles and permissions. Hoping everybody can take a ton away from this session. We'll do our best to make this as hands-on as possible. Don't feel like you need to be scratching down notes. We will send out a copy of the recording. And as Mark will walk you through, we've also got a guide that will help you with some of these challenges as well, and is going to cover a lot of the things that we've talked about today. And based on the questions and any feedback that we get, we may also make some final changes to this too. So what we'll do is we'll pass it over to Mark. So Mark, here it goes over to you. And if you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A function of Zoom or into the chat. We'll do our best to respond to these as we go through, and then we'll try to save some time towards the end to cover any additional discussion that's required. So thanks, everybody. Looking forward to it.
Hey, thanks, Paul. This is Mark Walker. And thanks, everybody, for making time out of your day to join us today. One of the things we run into all the time is implementing segregation duties controls and helping people manage their NetSuite account is questions about user roles and permissions and how they relate to everything else in NetSuite. And they really are, a central part of the NetSuite architecture. So one of the things we thought about doing to help people out was to walk them through a very practical view. Walk you guys through a very practical view of how these different components fit together, what you need to know about them in order to manage NetSuite effectively, and also some things that we think about all the time that may not have crossed people's minds. So I'll be trying to simplify a lot of complexity and take you on a quick tour so you understand how these different tools are used together in order to implement NetSuite properly. So we're going to cover a bunch of different things. We're going to cover them fairly quickly. As Paul mentioned, there's a user guide or a sort of a little course that goes along with this. So you don't need to make notes or anything like this. You'll have the recording, and you'll also have the guide that goes through all of this. In addition to that, though, there's a number of people, quite a number of people on our team who are flat out experts in this. And if you have any questions or you're stuck or you're trying to figure something out, we don't necessarily implement NetSuite for people, but we do untangle NetSuite for people. And so we do help people understand how to do that. And so our team, Amy Carlson, who leads customer success, used to be a customer actually, recruited her way to come over to the dark side and work with us. And quite a number of other people on our team, Ramona Henningham, those people will be glad to walk you through this in more specifics and more detail. So we're going to be covering, first of all, the structure of user roles, particularly understanding how permissions and permission levels and required forms and list views and role settings and script dependencies all come together, and then how do you methodically go through cleaning up roles. And then we're going to do a deeper dive into permissions. We find that one of the most common things is people get completely scattered around what permissions are and very confused by the terminology that's in there. NetSuite's done a great job of documenting what permissions are what, but the use of the terms that they use causes some confusion. And so we're going to talk through this in a practical way. And again, we're going to talk about how you clean up unused permissions. A lot of the SOD conflicts, segregation of duties conflicts we have, a lot of the user access management problems people run into has to do with unused or unassigned roles, but also unused or not fully used permissions. And people are very nervous to clean those up because they don't know what the result is going to be, and we'll walk you through some practical steps to manage that. And then we're going to also then talk about managing access, both in the very, very important segregation of duty sense and a very practical, real-world way to implement segregation duties quickly. A lot of the segregation of duties approaches out there are sort of audit approaches, and we really believe it should be an ongoing activity. But then also how to manage your access process, how to manage your access that you're granting to people on an ongoing basis so that you protect your data. And if we have some time, we'll talk about advanced access control capabilities, implementing two-factor authentication, which I strongly recommend to almost everybody, single sign-on, which really applies for people with an overriding security architecture, and IP locking, which may be very important for locking down very critical access in some circumstances, but is not a general rule that would apply to most people, a very, very advanced capability. So that's the last slide I'm going to show you, though, because we're really going to do this inside NetSuite. And we're going to explore this by actually looking at the interface and walking through some things. All right. So first of all, let's start by looking at a user role. So what is a user role, right? So a user role is, in fact, the definition of all of the different access capabilities that somebody sees when they log into NetSuite. So this is, I'm logged in here as, let me get this Zoom thing out of the way. I'm logged in here as a VP of sales role and a demo account. And the user role is designed around a center. And a center is a point of view of NetSuite, a way of looking at NetSuite. And so in this center, in the sales center, we're seeing that the information is organized around the sorts of ways of looking at data that somebody in sales would think of it as. So we have activities and leads and opportunities and customers. And then we have things that normally might end up for example, administrator just being another report. We have a tab called forecasting. And there's some tools, different types of tools that are set up underneath these. These, we'll come back to these later, but what's determining these is primarily what's called tasks and records in NetSuite. And so you have the ability to, when you have view capability on a permission, it determines what goes in here, but the order in which they appear is determined by the center. If I go back here, I'm going to go back into admin mode. We'll see the admin mode in the same account looks quite different, right? So here we have all of the transactions and all the relationships are all just in transactions and lists because the administrator isn't trying to affect the business process. They're trying to manage the entire system. You see their permissions. With administrator, of course, has every permission, means that they can see absolutely everything. In order to cram everything into one view, we've now organized it, pretty much around the major record types in NetSuite. So we have transactions, we have lists, we have reports. The strong point tab here is an example of a custom tab that's been added into a center. We'll talk a lot more about that later. And then we have other types of tabs that relate to the administration of the system, like our customization tab here, right? So that's what centers do. Now, when you create a role, you cannot change the center. So roles have to be created from a center. And you can make a custom center if you want, but once you have centers, you can't change them. So when we go to create a role, we can go and we can choose the center, and choosing the center effectively is not choosing the permissions that the person is going to have, it's choosing the layout of the navigation that they're going to have for all intents and purposes. Okay. So once we get into a role, see that I'm going to skip over all this stuff and come back to it in a second. We really want to talk about the permissions that people have. And the permissions are set up on the permissions sub-tab of the role, and they are organized into transactions, reports, lists, setup, and custom. Right? So transactions are the ones people are usually most concerned about because that's the ability to, of course, affect the business processes and the GL. But of course, lists are where you're going to find non-transactional records. So things like customers, vendors, items, all your master data is under lists. And reports are, this is really around the ability to see or customize the different reports that come in the NetSuite reporting package, right? So when we're building reports in NetSuite, we very rarely build them entirely from scratch. We're modifying reports, and that permission these permissions are here appear in reports. And setup is, as you'd expect, the ability to edit any of the configuration in NetSuite, right? So you can actually change different parts of it. And it's not, people often think of it as an all or none thing, that you can either be the administrator and you can set things up, or you're not the administrator and you can't set anything up. That's not true. There's an administrator or a setup setting for essentially almost everything you can do. So even down to you can basically allow somebody to just set up CSV preferences or just set the body fields, but not the custom transaction fields. So you can make very, very specific, here's the custom transaction fields as opposed to custom body fields or custom item fields. So you can very tightly restrict what people are able to do. And this is really important because sometimes people give the administrator role when what they really need to do is allow a person just to be able to set up one thing. So that misunderstanding is what we see when people are giving away the administrator role too often, and that giving away the administrator role too often is the most fundamental security mistake that we see most commonly. Okay, so permissions. We're going to dig into permissions in much more detail in a second, but the permissions are not just standard, right? They have a permission, which is a group of capabilities, which we'll dig into more in a second, and then we have different levels of them. So the next biggest mistake people give is they give too much permission. So just because you need to view something doesn't mean you need to be able to edit it. And there are 4 different levels of a permission for most permissions. There's 4 different levels, and we can sort of see them if we go in here. View, which means that you can see the data, but you cannot change it. And this will also determine whether or not a link to that record or the path to that capability, if the capability exists in your navigation or appears on the form, if it's a task. Like if you have the ability to well, almost always it'll be if it's view, it'll just be navigation in the pull down in the navigation, and you'll be able to see the records. This will also normally allow you to search for the record as well. Create means that you can make a new version, new record, but you can't edit it. And so this is good for input capabilities, but when you don't want people to be able to change things after they've created it, you can then just leave it at create. Edit means you can see it, you can create it, you can also change it after it's being created, but you can't delete it. And then full means, for most permissions, there are some exceptions to this, but for most permissions it means that you can delete it as well. Some of the exceptions we're normally talking about generally have to do around setup capabilities, where view and create and well, view has meaning, but say edit and full don't really mean anything because you can't actually delete the setting, that sort of thing. So generally speaking, understanding that view is not going to mess up your navigation, and people still be able to see all the information, and that you don't need edit to create records, and almost nobody needs full ever, because deleting records should be very, very tightly controlled. Really helps us lay the framework for what you would do to make a well cleaned up and well managed account. So the other thing we often see is getting this right. Basically what most people seem to do is they don't know what level to give, so they give the highest level. That's exactly the wrong answer. If you don't know what permission you should be giving somebody, you should give them the lowest possible permission, that usually being view, unless you have a really strong business case for why they would need to create data or edit data and move it up that way. Okay. So in addition, permissions grant the ability to do things, and they put some restrictions on it around, as we talked about. But there's also ways of restricting things. And one of the ones that people most commonly don't think about is the concept of restricted views, of which are our forms and our searches. So if you give somebody permission to view a record, then you've given them permission to view everything about that record. Now, the only exception to this is in the advanced employee permissions. If you have that capability turned on and you've acquired that from NetSuite, which has to do with part of suite people, you can subdivide the employee record and just grant the ability to see some parts of the employee record, but not necessarily all of the employee record. But the general case way of doing that is to manage it through forms. And we can see that for every single type of record, and here we're looking at the transactions, which are of course records, we have the ability to decide whether or not a given form is available to that role. So if they could, if they were picking a form to use, which forms would be available to be selected. We can specify whether one is preferred. And if it is preferred, we can also specify that it's restricted. So in this case, for this role, the standard vendor bill is the only form that this role is allowed to use for bills, right? Once we've made it restricted. By way of contrast, on the bill credit, there are 3 different forms available. And when you have this, what you'll see is that there will usually be a field to select which form you're using, and somebody can do that. So this is particularly used when you want to simplify a record, either to protect the privacy of the information in that record, or to protect whether or not people can edit certain fields or not, by simply making those fields in line or inactive, basically uneditable in that form. Or if we want to be able to break a single record, in effect, into multiple different records for multiple steps in the workflow. So we just make it uncluttered. So, you know, the sales team sees the customer record as being a very, very simple record with all the sales type information on it. The finance team sees a more complex customer record with all the finance information on it, and the provisioning team sees an entirely different view of the customer with the provisioning information, forward, or you could think maybe not provisioning, but customer success, or some other team that's dealing with a customer's life cycle is less interested in, the sales process stuff. And you can use these restricted views to restrict access to data. You can also do this, very, very similar capability can be done with searches, but in the forms, there's a finite number of forms that you can have. In searches, there's an infinite number of searches. And so you can go through and create a relationship between a user role and a search. And you can make that search, I can pick a search here. Let's say I'm gonna pick, for bill materials records, I'm gonna pick now, I'm not sure what there is one for bill materials. Let me pick another one that's simpler. Let me pick, let's just go to customer. There we go, okay. So now we can pick whichever search form, which would be the default form if you're searching for customers. What if you went to the customer search, what would be the default view that you would get? We can pick that. We can pick how we'd like our search results structured and pick the same or a different view for that. We can show how list views are going to appear. So if you just went and showed all of the customers, how that would be structured, or if you had a standard portlet with a list of customers, what the default position would be. And once you've selected something, you can make it restricted. So you can say you can restrict the list view, you can restrict the dashboard view, and you can restrict the sublist view. So the sublist view is the view that appears on another record where that record is being referenced. So for example, if you had partners with a list of customers, the view that showed what data showed up under a partner record about those customers, that would be a sublist view. And you can make those restricted. So you can actually not only decide which ones are preferred, which you can do right from the search record as well, but you can make them restricted. So if you set this and you don't have restricted, it means it's the preferred one. If you set this and make it restricted, then it's actually part of the user role itself. Now this is very important because we can use this capability to impose segregation of duties. In other words, the person, even though theoretically they have access to that record, they can never ever do the thing that you were worried about because they simply don't have access to that field. And we can use it to impose data security, and we can use it to do all sorts of things. But when you're thinking about a user role, you need to think about that anything on this list here, or any of the forms over here, are actually part of the user role in the same way as the permissions are part of the user role. And in StrongPoint, our system already understands that, so that in addition to being able to put change control around user roles, for example, we can put and around user role assignments, although the SOD capabilities around this are much more extensive. We can also put specialized change control around user role related objects. So if you have an object that if a form or a search that's being referenced by a user role, those forms and searches need to be treated at the same level of change control as the user role itself, because they're part of the user role. Right? And so we can manage that in this way. Okay. So we've talked about permissions is how we grant access, and forms, or at least restricted forms and restricted searches, are ways that we potentially limit access, but we can limit access in other ways as well. And one of the most common ways is to impose restrictions, and there are two big groups of restrictions. If you have a One World account, you will have these subsidiary restrictions up here, and if you don't have a One World account, you will have segment-based restrictions for class, department, and location down here. They work essentially the same way, very, very similar. But the objective of this is to allow one group of user roles to be used across multiple subsidiaries or multiple departments of the company. And then to also enhance the restriction on items and data to help people continue to do the right job. So let's talk about what that means. So in the first case, imagine that you had two teams, one in Canada and one in the United States. And they actually dealt with different customers. They had different customer bases because the Canadian arm dealt with the Canadian customers and the US arm dealt with the US customers. Then what you're able to do is you're able to say, okay, well, we would like to now restrict access to the Canadian companies can only see either either give them access to all subs, which is maybe not what we want to do. We can give them access just to the subsidiary that the user is assigned to. So if I'm an employee of Canada, I can see all the Canadian data. And if an employee, or I can interact with all the Canadian data. If I'm an employee of the US, I can interact with all the US data. And then I can choose to allow you to be able to see across this. So for example, if we wanted the Canadians to be able to check whether we already had a global relationship with the company, we're going to inquire in Canada, say, oh, has this company already got a relationship with us in the US? They would be able to look that up if we turned this on, but not necessarily change it, right? And these are hierarchical. So if you grant somebody at one level, it'll cascade down, right? So if you're at the top, it'll cascade down to other things. Okay, so that's subsidiaries, but you can do the same thing with class, department, and location. And the common things that these are used for is to, for example, make sure that people are using the correct accounts when entering expenses, so that if you are, if you're in the Canadian subsidiary or in a certain department, you don't even have access to the accounts that the people in a different department or a different subsidiary would have access to. Or you may not have access to the items. You might have slightly different items, slightly different legal terms that go into our quotes in Canada than the US. These restrictions will enable us to block out the wrong selections and thereby improve workflow. So this is often an overlooked capability of user roles, and we often see, therefore, many copies of the same user role, one for each individual sub, when in fact, in many cases, a correct use of form restrictions and departmental or class segment restrictions or subsidiary restrictions could have made it much simpler. Well, there's, of course, a legitimate reason why you would have different versions of roles for very similar or nominally similar job functions in different countries, and that's because those countries may, in fact, have different staff with different responsibilities, and that's a perfectly legitimate reason to have different user roles, and that may actually lead to needing to have different segregation of duties rules for those different jurisdictions, because you simply can't slice up responsibilities that easily in many cases. So, so when we talk about a user role, we can talk about the permissions, the forms and searches which restrict access to data in an interface way, as with dashboards do that as well. And then we have this ability to restrict by subsidiary and segment. In addition to this, there are employee level restrictions so that you can actually restrict people from seeing their own data, or just where they can view other people's data, but they can't change it. They can own subordinate unassigned, so they can say, if it's, I can say, for example, you have a sales manager with a sales team under her. She can interact with anything assigned to her or assigned to any member of her team, right? And anything unassigned. And this is where this is most commonly used, by the way. Most commonly used in sales, organizing sales teams. Secondarily most commonly used, or not that commonly used, but they're used in support teams as well, because those are the records that have employee ownership type relationships. The sales rep and the and support rep are these ownership relationships. And they can also apply, of course, the place where you commonly see this is if you give a partner interface, you don't want the partner just to be able to see all the other partner's customers. And so this is, that's where the partner relationship is used here as well. Okay. So, so that's essentially the structure of a role. And when you're, the most common thing we see in people's accounts that cause confusion and problems is that people won't have properly cleaned up their roles, right? And so one of the first things we always want to look at is what's used and what's not being used. Sorry, I just remembered something. There's one other thing you need to worry about. And if any of you are public companies, auditors definitely ask about this, which is the fact that scripts, you can go completely around all of this with scripting. Right? And the reason is that script deployments allow you to execute in a specific role. So it's very, very important to be able to identify and sort through any of the script deployments that are executing as an administrator role or executing in some other way. And StrongPoint has a specific, when we document script deployments, we particularly pull this information out because it's so commonly requested. It's very difficult to search for this in NetSuite. There isn't a search that really shows this, but there is one in StrongPoint, and we can see right here. This is a search that shows us any script deployments that have execute as admin turned on. And then you can go through and you can start to look at and see, what exactly is going on with this search, right? And if these things come out of managed packages, and most of these are, by the way, most of these are coming out of managed packages. But if they are coming out of managed packages, not a big deal. But often developers will, because the requirements never specified what role, they will test in administrator mode, and they didn't test in every single role. So they'll think, well, the most simple way of doing this is I'll just set this to execute as administrator. Well, what you might have done is you might have gone around the restrictions in the role. There might have been a good reason why somebody wasn't allowed to do that. And it's not necessarily wrong, by the way, because normally when the script is approved for a particular purpose. You just need to be able to demonstrate that you've turned your mind to it and you thought about the fact that that these were there. So having a list like this, which you can easily generate in StrongPoint, is really important. You can also go into the document. We also show this in the documentation, so you can go in the documentation and see what role it's executing as, and this is searchable as well. So so when final step in understanding your roles is just to make sure that you have reviewed all the ones that have execute this administrator turned on, and made sure that you understand why that is. And the critical thing will be to go through and look at the documentation to see what it touches. If it doesn't touch anything that's sensitive, or it comes from from an external bundle, then you probably don't care, right? Because it's probably not that big of a deal, but if it comes from something that one of your developers wrote, it probably is important. Okay, so that's the basic structure of user roles. Now we want to think about what we can do to help manage them more effectively. And one of the things we should be doing is pruning them on a regular basis. Now, if you're going to implement SOD, you're almost certainly going to have to prune them, right? Almost right away. In fact, we would say that's the very first step before implementing SOD. The normal way of doing it is that you get a tool and you analyze, or you get EY or Deloitte or KPMG or PwC, and they come in and they analyze all your permissions. They come back with a whole bunch of problems, most of which are theoretical. But if you approach it as saying, look, first of all, we only want to keep the user roles that we need, we can get along pretty quickly. So one of the first things to look at is to look for any roles that first one, look at any roles that are assigned but not in use. So we have a bunch of searches that are built into StrongPoint. They're actually built into all of StrongPoint. They're right here in the user management section, right? So you can see any roles that are not assigned to anybody, all of those, inactivate them. If they haven't been assigned to anybody, unless you just created them in the last few minutes, you want to get rid of them by just going in and unassigning them. And I'll show you that in a second. That one's fairly easy to find. The other group is, always it's fairly easy to find in StrongPoint anyway. But these are just safe searches that anybody could build. We just happen to build them and put them in StrongPoint. The next one though, roles assigned but not in use, that's a little more complicated to do. So you got to basically say, look, anything that hasn't been, any of these roles, they are assigned to people, but the person has either never logged in or they haven't logged in for a very long time. Well, those assignments can also be pulled, right? So hierarchy, if the role is not assigned to anybody right now, inactivate it, get rid of it. And the reason for that is because if it's not there, nobody can give it to anybody. And that means you don't have to worry about SOD conflicts in that role. You don't have to worry about testing things against that role. You don't want roles sitting around that somebody could accidentally pick. And in particular, nobody should have standard roles ever, right? So the standard roles that NetSuite provides are really super useful because they provide a great basis for you to begin to design a role, but they should not be used by anyone except for administrator, which is the only standard role anybody should ever have. Maybe employee center, but I would even suggest probably not that. And the reason you don't want to have standard roles is you can't customize them without destroying somebody's dashboard. So if somebody sets up their dashboard and you want to just add one permission, you have to wipe out the dashboard, right? So you should never ever use standard roles at all. But these often the next thing we want to worry about is things that are there, that nobody's actually using it, and you can go and unassign these things. This step is really important, for making sure that you've got all your test cases down, because if people have roles, then you have to think about, well, why do they have them and are they using them? But more to the point, from a segregation of duties point of view, multiple roles are where segregation of duties projects go to die, right? So you want to limit the number of people who have it, because every time somebody has multiple roles, it will almost certainly produce a conflict, because that's just the reason they probably have the other role is because there's something they can't do in their main role, and you're going to have to justify it. So you want to get rid of any of the unused roles as quickly as possible. And this search is available right in StrongPoint, but essentially what it is it's just a saved search of the login dates of all the users, and basically trying to figure out which ones are not actually being used. It's simpler in StrongPoint because we actually track the date last used in a number of different ways, so it makes it easier to do, but you can still do it. It's researching the log information. Okay. Now, once you have the user roles cleaned up, you've now gotten yourself to the point where I've got a whole bunch of user roles. I know which ones are being used. Now I want to make sure that I understand what's in them. So we're going to turn our attention to the permissions. And NetSuite has a very useful guide on permissions. And get out of here for a second. And it's available right from help. And basically it goes through, and every single permission that you'll see in NetSuite has a permission name. It's a subtab on the user role. You'll see almost all the subtabs are listed, and it has a usage description. Now, what gets people sort of bent out of shape is that is this language allows usage of the search, transaction, numbering, audit, log, task, right? And then allows usage of the transaction, numbering, audit, log, search. And people are saying, well, what's the difference between those two things? And the short answer is, for most people, it doesn't matter because they're controlled by the same permission. These are just two different ways of getting to the same thing. Essentially, a task is one of those elements on the navigation that makes it easier to do something. The reason we have two of them is you can get there in multiple directions. You can go in through saved searches and you can search for this information, or you can go through the navigation to get to this information. And so, but if you notice, they're not subdividable. So we have, I think it's 636 permissions to be concerned about, and those permissions have all these different tasks associated with them. And what gets people is 4,600 something individual things that it allows you to do. People tend to get themselves all too bent out of shape about it. My view of it is you think of it this way. View permission gives the ability to navigate to it, to that capability. In this case, the transaction numbering audit log, or the account, the account record as part of the chart of accounts. It gets you to be able to get there. After that, create, edit, and full have the same meanings we explained before, right? For almost everything, right? Occasionally, you'll see something where it'll show that the minimum level that you can select for it is not view, but create. But almost always, it has the word new in it, which makes perfect sense, right? There's no such thing as navigating to new, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? So when you go to new, you're creating something. Now, one way this should be interpreted is if you give them something that says, if you give them only the view level, they will not see that new. If I go back into our NetSuite account for a second, if I go transactions, purchases, purchase orders, and what's a good example? If I go down into this, I will not see, and it's a good example where I can see a new button, but you will not have the ability to create it. You'll just have the list and the search. If you've only got view, you will not have the ability to actually create it. Okay. Okay. So when you see this, that's all that means. Everything else, it's fairly well laid out. A great example of this is when you're wondering about what everything covers, and yes, I know there's a lot of them. You can more or less figure out what it covers by looking for this type of terminology. It allows viewing and editing of the manufacturing operation task record, manufacturing planning time record, the manufacturing project record, and the work order record. Okay, so the records covered by this are the ones that you're allowed to edit. So this becomes really important to figuring out if a permission is being used. You want to look for what you're allowed to create or edit or approve, right? Or view, create, edit, or approve in terms of a reference to a record. And notice a work order, which we often refer to as a transaction, is a record, right? So when you want to find out what the scope of a permission is, go looking for the records. Everything else is just navigating, it's just explaining how you get there. right? And so if you understand that, understanding permissions gets way simpler. Now, what we've done in StrongPoint is we've used that to create tools that allow us to understand which permissions are actually being used. And so, for example, we can go through, and this is actually done in our account because nobody's actually using the demo account, and it shows the last date that anybody used any particular permission. So, we have the customer success director. Transactionally, the only thing she actually uses is quotes. So she has, and this goes back 3 months ago. If I wanted to, I could set it back 6 months ago or a year ago. Probably go back in 3-month increments just to make it run. But I can see, what role it was, what type of transaction it was, what level, maximum level was being used. So whether they were creating or editing, and what context was being used in case this is happening because of the script or something. And I can see the last date. So I can see that this role is only held by one person in our company. It's Amy Carlson, the Director of Customer Success. And the only thing she ever gets involved in is doing quotes. This would likely be being involved in a renewal process where she's just helping one of our account managers deal with a complex renewal or issuing a quote to them. But we can see that she does it very rarely, right? So we can see she's only done one in the last 3 months, and that's entirely appropriate. Amy does not normally make quotes, but that's the worry, right? When we're changing roles and we're cleaning things up, we're worried that, is there something they use occasionally? And it's that worry that always causes people not to clean things up. You can do this, you can figure this stuff out. By the way, this again is a search using standard NetSuite metadata. You can get it, it's included in StrongPoint. If you don't have StrongPoint, just ask us for it. We'll explain you how to do it. It's not secret, it's just clever, right? And so, having this capability allows us to go through and clean up permissions. Now that is super, super, super important, right? Because when you go to implement SOD, or when you want to restrict the scope of permission, you can now understand whether somebody is using any transactional permission. And so now, even though you don't know anything about our account, you with a very high level of certainty could say, we could turn all the other transactional permissions off for the customer success director. We turn them all to view, because we can't see whether people are viewing things. There's no system notes or no tracking data for that. So the safest way to go is to move them back to view. But if we can say with a very high level of confidence, if we were to change her role and remove all the permissions that had to do with any transactional right and make those all just view only for Amy, with the exception of quotes, which we would leave at the create level, because maybe we'd leave it at the edit level, but we'd leave it at a very low level, Amy would not be affected by that whatsoever, or that role would never be affected by it. And that evidence is what causes decisions to be made quickly. So using the metadata, all this metadata exists in your NetSuite account, using it effectively helps get your projects done quickly. By the way, a critical thing to do here is if you are anticipating a role cleanup project or an SOD project and you do not have enable system notes on record creation turned on, turn it on, right? It's off by default because most people don't have to be able to tell the system notes about when things are created. But if you are planning a role cleanup, you need the data to include people who are creating things. And if you don't turn the system notes on, there's no evidence for that for most records. So you're going to want to turn that on. Okay. So we talked about user roles. We talked about permissions and how permissions are just bundles of capabilities. We talked about how to understand what records are affected by permission without getting caught up in the noise of the very, very detailed and useful documentation that NetSuite has prepared. And we talked about how view permission affects navigation primarily, and how you can use save searches inside NetSuite to understand the transactional activity. Oh, by the way, we also have versions of this for for entities as well, company entities, and we also have it for any other record. So you can do this for items, you can do this for absolutely every different type of record. It's just that people tend to be most bent out of shape about transactions because that's the things that post to the GL, and usually less bent out of shape about some of the other records. So transactions and entities, super important. When you go to the other records version, it defaults to items because that's the other one that people are most interested in. We have a version of that for everything else too. Okay. So now we have the ability to clean up our permissions, and now let's sort of talk about what the implications of that are. Well, the first implication is that it can radically change how quickly we can implement SOD. So I'm going to go. Actually, I'm going to pop into the guide that we're working on, and I'm going to pop down here and. Well, by the way, you can see it goes through everything we've just talked about. It just reminds you of all the best practices. But I want to talk about this right here. And let me sort of expand this out a little bit. See if that looks good. All right. So the biggest mistake that most companies make implementing segregation of duties is that they don't clean up their user roles first, right? So they go along and they have a bunch of rules and they apply them to their account, and guess what? They have, potentially thousands of conflicts, right? And the most common cause of that is that some of those conflicts are real, right? And they need to be addressed, but many of them are not. And what they are is they're legacy conflicts. They either relate to standard roles that are still enabled, old versions of roles that are still enabled, or multiple roles that are assigned to people, even though the person's not using it. So doing that role cleanup is vital to having an efficient project. The other thing that's super vital, or the mistake people make going the other direction, is don't change it. If you don't change the user roles, if you don't have to, or change them as little as possible. And the reason for that is, in theory, if you change a user role and you actually change the permissions, you're going to have to go back and retest things. So you're only going to want to change the permissions when you absolutely know what the answer is. And the permission search that we just did is how you would know. And you can only possibly know down to view. So you can only know the person is not creating or editing any records, right? You can't know whether they're looking at them. You have to go and talk to everybody to find out what they looked at. But it's just the navigation. If you leave it there and they're not using it, no harm, no foul. There are no SOD violations that I can think of that purely are on the ability to view. There's access violations where you wouldn't want people to be able to view stuff, particularly in regulated pharma companies and things like that where you have sensitive data, but there's no SOD problem with it. So what you're going to look to do is your first way of resolving things is to move permissions from create or edit to view, or even in some cases we say full to view, right? And once you move it to view, that will resolve the problem. What we often see people do is get into a whole role redesign project, and that just takes too long. And it's a good second effort. It's like then do it departmentally to clean up the roles and get rid of permissions you really don't need and simplify. But there's not a big, in terms of return for your investment, 90% of it is resolving the SOD violations, and 5% of it is simplifying the navigation, and nobody really cares about the last 5%, right? So you really want to focus on figuring out what you can switch to view. So you're going to find and inactivate all the unused roles and unassigned roles. So that's roles that are assigned but unused, and roles that haven't been assigned to anybody, and you're going to inactivate those. And I'm going to definitely do this in a demo account. You can do this if you go down to user roles, manage roles. And if you turn on inactives, if you hit inactive and submit, thank you, thank goodness. If you go through and you hit inactive on these roles, not only will it remove it from the interface so nobody can select it again, it will also remove it for everybody it's assigned to, which is a massive time saver, right? So if you want to remove permission from lots of people, because a role has been assigned, it was legacy, it was just left there. You do not have to go employee by employee to do it. You can simply click right here, hit submit, it will disappear. Okay, so super fast. So going back to our thing, then, and this will deal with the completely unassigned roles. You will have to go through and remove unused role assignments though. So the search will show you, the search we were just looking at will show you everybody who has unassigned, who's not using roles they have assignments to. But if that role is being used by other people, you can't just inactivate it. You have to go to that person's record and remove their access. And you can do this, of course, you do this in Sandbox and before you do it in production. And then you check for the SOD conflicts. So notice normally this is step number 1. No, do not do this as step number 1. Do it as step number 3. And you're checking for the conflicts inside the roles using StrongPoint's library of rules, or if you're using another product, do it then too. But you're going to do the step then. And the reason what we're doing now is to say, is there any problem inside our roles? And if we do get any conflicts, we're going to then go and go and see if we can set the permissions backwards, right? Super simple. You go through, you look at that search, you go back to somebody and you go, okay, I need approval to set this to view. I would recommend that most companies, you get that approval in advance. You go, if we can't find any use of the permission in a role in the last, X months, we're going to set their permission to view and get your CIO or CFO, whoever owns the system, to sign off on that and go through it. And so we're going to do it in Sandbox first, but that's our policy. And that'll make your project go so much faster because 90% of your violations that aren't real conflicts can be resolved in that way. Then any remaining conflicts should be resolved based on existing controls if you have them. And if you don't have them, use StrongPoint Agent to resolve them. So in other words, people always want to build something, or often you can't actually resolve the conflict because there just aren't enough people. So what you want to do is you want to set up a saved search that would capture whenever that occurred. And remember, you only need to trap one side of the problem. So for example, say Mary theoretically has the ability to edit items, and that conflicts with all sorts of other things, essentially, or let's do vendors. And she also has the ability to create sales orders, right? And so, or to write checks. And there's definitely things that can cause SOD violations. Well, if Mary doesn't normally edit vendors, or the specific fields that you care about Mary editing, you can simply create a saved search that looks at the system and say, did Mary edit these fields? And then you can set up Agent to monitor it, and it'll create a complete log of it. And that's a provable control. And you have to review this with your auditor. It's not my job to give you advice on what the provable controls are. But what people tend to want to do is somehow either separate them or build some external system that's going through the review process external to NetSuite for something that's not supposed to happen anyway, right? And by using saved searches and by using Agent to trap the incidents of those saved searches, you can make things go super quickly. And finally, you then, once you've got them resolved inside the roles, then you check for multi-role conflicts. Often what people do is they look for all the violations across the whole system. StrongPoint says, no, first look inside the roles, then fix that problem, then look at the multi-role people. There will be some people who need multiple roles, and you don't want to get down to dealing with those people until the end. And again, usually the answer here is to remove that extra role. You should have already done that earlier in the process, but usually that drives home. People say, well, do we want to explain this to our auditors, or do we want to get rid of it? If not, then use an agent control, because you can literally say, if Mary specifically, not somebody with this user role, but Mary does this, we want it trapped. And that's easy to set up as a saved search and easy to trap using Agent. Okay. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I do want to leave some time for questions. The guide also has some information about using StrongPoint to block granting access, but also some information about some other things you can do to supplement user role data security, particularly two-factor authentication, which I strongly recommend to almost everybody. It should apply to almost everything. It's applied to your Google account. You should apply it to your user roles. We use it. It's super convenient. All admin roles are required to use it. It's very reliable, very safe. But in addition to that, if single sign-on is the next level. Particularly, the big thing about single sign-on is it's useful for companies that have that are managing their overall application access centrally. And usually, what they're doing is they're using some system that has essentially threat detection built into it. So if somebody's coming in from an unknown IP address, you would catch them, and it would flag unusual behavior, unusual time of day, those sort of things. And so NetSuite doesn't have strong tools for that. The way they dealt with it is single sign-on. And finally, the last part that should only really be applied to very, very sensitive things, but you may want to apply it when you have strangers coming into your system, is IP address locking, where you might turn around and say, look, I'm going to block some people. That won't apply to most of you, but it is something that is there and is the highest level of, pretty much the highest level of security. Okay. So, Paul, do we have any quick questions or anything we can just quickly chat about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one that came up is that we will be sharing this guide with you. We're going to make any final edits from questions and polish it up a little bit and have it out in the next couple of days. So we'll address that one right away. The next question that came up earlier was asking why NetSuite standard permissions aren't recommended for use.
Right, and the reason is because if somebody gets granted it, they may very well go and customize their dashboard. And if you want to add and make any change in the permissions later, you have to wipe out that dashboard. There's no way to carry the information, what they did, to set up their reminders and do anything that they did. There's no way to carry that information through into the next dashboard. So, so that tends to inhibit, it either causes you a lot of work or afterwards. And by the way, this isn't just my advice. This is NetSuite's advice. They're meant as references. And even if you just take them and you go, it was the Employee Center, and now our version of it is called Flow Employee Center, perfect, or StrongPoint Employee Center, that one little change is going to make it a lot safer for you. It's not that they're wrong necessarily. It's that you can't customize them.
Awesome. So next question is, what is the simplest way to create a read-only role for non-accounting staff, but that allows for creating and running financial reports?
Right. So I think we sort of covered that, right? So you want to take the accountant, if we go back to our role, you want to take all of the permissions that appear on, take an accountant role, right? And by the way, I believe there is a view accountant role that may not be exactly what you need. But if you take any role, if you go back to our role that we had here, let's go this role, you can simply just go through and you can go through and set all of the permissions to view, but you can then pick which reports you're going to allow people to give people the ability to customize reports at all, and then you can go through and specify which reports they're able to access by using the view level. So this is the ability to customize it right here, and this it has all the things we'd expect. You can I'm not exactly sure what view report customization means, but I think it's just view custom reports, and then you can create, edit, and full, and then you can figure out which reports they can do by just adding or removing the permission to see those reports. So I hope that answers the question. By the way, if it doesn't, by all means follow up with us and I'll give a simpler answer.
I have one more here for now, and it's what's the difference between the administrator and system administrator roles?
Administrator, fundamentally, the administrator has the ability to grant other administrative permissions, which system administrator does not, and the administrator actually has the ability to delete everything, right? The administrator owns the account, right? So they just think of it like a sysop. I know it's called system administrator, thinks it would be like the sysop. No, the administrator role, the formal administrator role, is it. The system administrator is just a layer of permissions below that, right? So they can do so the system administrator can manage just about everything else, but some very, very fundamental things, including the ability to write everything out. The other big thing is the administrator can see everything. System administrator cannot see absolutely everything.
Okay, awesome. So that's it for questions for now. So we will polish up the recording, polish up the guide, and we'll circle back with an email in the next day or two at the most. If you have any specific questions, like Mark mentioned, please feel free to reach out to us directly.
Yeah, I hope this is helpful, people. And any part which left you with more questions than answers, please don't hesitate to give us a call.